Well, today's guest is Mr. Scott Berman, who is the principal founder of Panther Agency, and he's also a principal at Institutional Cannabis. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
So, Scott, you obviously have a very diverse background. Tell us, how did you make your journey into cannabis?
Sure. So I was involved with an advertising business that started in 2008, and we did digital advertising for political campaigns. And in 2014, I started working for the Marijauana Policy Project, and we were running data-driven, audience-targeted ads in Alaska and Oregon. And we got involved politically through that, and after I saw what happened in that cycle, I realized there was a lot more opportunity coming quickly. And that's when we started to really get in shortly after the election cycle of 2014.
Amazing. And when you talk about data, what kind of data were you looking at and what did you do with it?
Well, at that point in time, we were looking at voter data mostly. So we were taking polling data on marijuana and comparing it to actual voters. So for example, we did a big poll and we found out that, and I don't remember the details, but a certain percentage of females between the 40 and 60 would be in favor of cannabis legalization. Mm-hmm. And then, over a certain age, you would be, and that's probably against it. And so we kind of forecasted what each voter would think. Obviously, if you have a 25-year-old male voter, they're going to look at it differently than a 75-year-old female or male. Age doesn't, I don't mean to include gender. I'm more talking about age, when mm-hmm. it comes to cannabis. And so what we did was we looked at that, and then we began serving ads to each type of voter based on that polling data. And then after we did that, we actually took the online data that came from those ads and then put that all together to make it stronger.
So there's a lot that you said there. First of all, how did you monetize this information? I know data can be tricky in terms of monetization. So who was paying for this?
So basically, the original person that paid for this was actually the Marijauana Policy Project. And they, for many years, have worked on ballot initiatives across the country, and they raise money from donors. And then when it comes to election season, they run advertising in support of these ballot initiatives. Mm-hmm. Many times on the ballot, it could be an environmental issue or a whole host of other issues. These guys do ballot initiatives for cannabis. So in the beginning, we used it for them, but 2 years later, in 2016, we used the same voter data and cannabis data to sell it to a lot of other people. So we knew that it worked, and we decided to market it to political consultants across the country, because even though you might not have a ballot initiative, cannabis was an issue in many other places. So congressional races used it at times to target people and say, I'm in favor of cannabis legalization. And so we kind of monetized it over the next couple of years in different ways.
Very interesting. Now, obviously, you are very familiar with political campaigns. Do you feel that in the upcoming election, cannabis will play a role?
Absolutely. This is one of my favorite subjects right now because I think we're going to have a whole host of things happen in November that are going to help accelerate the cannabis push. Number one, we're going to have simply a change in Congress. I think I'm going to go back to that age issue again, because every year older congressmen are replaced by younger ones. And so the younger ones tend to vote much more in favor of cannabis. So every 2 years, when Congress changes over, it helps. So just naturally. The second thing is we have potentially a whole bunch of blue waves coming. We don't know what's going to happen, certainly, but if there is a Democratic Senate and Biden becomes president, that could also change things. The third thing that's happening now is that COVID is making putting state budgets in really bad shape, and they're going to need to figure out ways to raise taxes and also create jobs. And we know that two things that cannabis brings to town every single time are taxes and jobs. And so a lot of these states that may have been considering cannabis, or at least opening it up and allowing more stores, all they have to do is look at some of the West Coast places and the tax revenues and say, you know what, maybe we should speed this up in our neighborhood as well. So I believe we are at a tipping point, and 2021 is going to be a big year for everything moving forward.
Now, if the administration doesn't change, do you foresee that being a problem for federal legalization of the plant?
I won't say no. I don't see it as a problem because I do see. I've seen. I think it would probably be better for some few reasons that it might, that it goes blue. But I don't think it'll be a big problem because there's so much money being made everywhere in blue states, red states. Cannabis is definitely one of those issues that does cross party lines many times. Mm-hmm. There are still more Democrats that support it than Republicans. However, the Trump administration, while they haven't been hugely friendly to cannabis, they also haven't gotten in its way that much. Mm-hmm. And in the last 3.5 years, there has been a lot of acceleration in certain markets. And so, there was a lot of noise in the beginning of the Trump administration that he was going to be a big problem for cannabis, and it really hasn't happened. So, yeah, I think it's going to be okay either way. And I again, go back to the financial impact that it's having in many of these other states, and we're going to need the money. And why not tax cannabis instead of letting the black market take it?
Now, you mentioned the black market. Is there any hope, especially for the California black market that seems to be the largest in the nation?
I just watched 60 Minutes, had a great piece on this. I have a little info this morning that I didn't have last night because they did something on this. And yeah, it's really a big problem in Cali. And a part of it is that there's oversupply. There's so many people growing, and it's really hard there's legal and illegal grows. They're all, there's record crops, and a lot of it is going to registered stores. However, there's not enough retail stores to take up all of the cannabis that's being grown. And so as it's been going on for many years, a lot of it is going on the black market, and a lot of it is going to other states. They seize cannabis from Oregon and California and many, many other states just by accident sometimes. Mm-hmm. So the black market is still doing well. I think the biggest thing that we can do to fix the black market in California is the regulatory environment with taxes are too high. And many people, I have many friends in California that say, I don't want to go to the store. It's way too expensive. I'll just get it from my guy. And so they don't want to go to the store to pay. It's been so easy to get it for many years that they don't want to pay the tax. And the other thing is that many cities, California is a very large state, and 80% of the cities still won't allow cannabis. So there's certain places in California that there's hardly any stores, and that needs to change.
Now, you mentioned something about interstate commerce. What is the data showing with interstate commerce? Is that something that we can look forward to happening in the near future, or are we still a ways away?
I think we're a ways away. I think before we do that, we need some sort of movement on the federal side. We now have this very odd situation where we have 33 medical and 11 adult use, and yet the federal government is still saying it's a Schedule I drug and illegal. So therefore, crossing state lines is not even close at this point. Mm-hmm. However, if we do get the movement from the federal government at some point, and we do get more states on, the numbers right now they're 33 and 11, and after November, they're going to go up to maybe 35 and 13 or something. There's going to be more states that approve it, I believe. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to be closer and closer to having the whole country. But until the federal government really weighs in, I think it will be impossible to do across state lines.
Interesting. What is your thought process on some of the prohibition states? I am in the Bible Belt at the moment, so it seems like it's a very anti-marijuana culture. What are your thoughts as far as those states turning the tide and legalizing for either medical or recreational?
I think one of the most fascinating things about the legalization movement is it started in 1996 with the first medical state, and Californians would look at you and be like, "Really? They're still not for it." I mean, it's really like it's really been a long slog. And so I do think eventually most of these states are coming on board at some point. I think Utah was the latest medical state, and people were surprised because it's starting to become more understood. I think that a lot of these states are seeing what's happening in other places, and they're not seeing any bad news. So they might travel out to Seattle or Portland or Las Vegas and see adult use cannabis, and then they go home and think, it's really not such a big deal anymore. We need to make this not a big deal. Just like there's liquor stores, all over town. We need to just say, there's another cannabis store. So I think even in that your part of the country, we're getting there. But it's slow go. In certain places, it's just still going to take some more time. However, I just wanted to add that about 85% of the country now has access to one or the other, either medical or adult use. So the states that don't have it yet have really small populations. So a very large majority of the country now actually has access. And that's another reason why I think it's almost going to be game over soon, because there's very few, I shouldn't say very few, but there's just not a lot of people that don't have it at this point.
Do you feel that federal legalization will happen before these states actually turn?
That's a great question. I think a lot has to do with what happens on November 3rd. Mm-hmm. This country is going in, all sorts of directions at the moment, and depending on who wins and who takes over cabinet roles, could make a big difference. So I think that it could stay stuck in the slow gear right now, or it could speed up a lot if certain things happen. But I wanted to add also that even no matter what happens on the national scale, you do have local things like Arizona and New Jersey, to give two examples, have adult use ballot initiatives. And they're both doing very well in the polling. New Jersey's up to 68% approval in the latest poll, and Arizona is polling strong as well. And there's a couple others. So even no matter what happens in Congress or president, you're going to have more adult use states right after Election Day. And so that's a big deal by itself.
Very fascinating. Well, thank you for sharing your insights about that. That is definitely a hot topic.
Can I just add one more thing?
Please, yes.
I also think in another way, one thing that we always talk about in the cannabis space is social justice. Mm-hmm. And a lot of really solid, good people that are in the cannabis space want to make that a big part of anything in the future. In other words, letting every prisoner out of jail. I think there's something called the Last Prisoner Project,
yes, mm-hmm.
which is trying to get every prisoner. Yeah, it's awesome. Trying to get every person out of jail that's locked up for cannabis in this country. And they made a lot of progress, but there's still people in jail. So I believe that there's going to be some change. We all hope there'll be some social justice change in this country in the coming months. And I believe that cannabis could play a role in that as well, because part of the legalization, or I should say the criminalization of cannabis, has largely been a racist policy from the beginning. It started in 1970 with Richard Nixon, and it unfortunately targeted a lot more African American and minority people than Caucasians, and it's been that way since the beginning. So a lot of people in the cannabis space want that corrected, and I think that we might have additional momentum for change based on the other change that's coming with Black Lives Matter. I hope that that's the case.
Yeah, it's still shocking how many people are languishing in prisons for minor marijuana offenses, for something that by and large, many people are consuming on medicinal basis. So here's hoping that...
When you think about,
Sorry,
I think history is going to be like, wait, it's medical marijuana. Why did you lock people in jail for it for a very long time if it's medical marijuana? I mean, alcohol was illegal and then it became legal, but there's no such thing as medical alcohol. So, right. I believe the history books will look at this as a pretty dumb rule.
Yeah, absolutely. And as some of these regulations are being lifted, there's a lot more studies really that are testifying to the power of the plant for medical purposes. So I think that's also a very exciting arena as well. What can the plants do? What are the numerous cannabinoids that are in the plants? What effects do they have on different indications? So I think there's a lot of exciting things that are coming down the plank as well.
One of the worst things about the war on drugs was not just the criminalization of people, but also they just stopped all research. They wouldn't even allow anyone to study this plant for so long. And the stuff that's happening in places like Israel on research on clinical trials are really amazing. You know, they discovered CBD, while doing these studies, and so we're finally allowing real scientists to study this plant. And what we're learning is pretty amazing. I read a lot about this and the effects. We all know that it has a lot of positive effects on a variety of things in the body and the way it connects with the endocannabinoid system. It's pretty remarkable. And so why not study it? I mean, it's really, that's another thing that doesn't make much sense, is that we haven't allowed scientists to really figure this out. And as you said, the more that we figure it out, the more we realize, wow, this is pretty awesome. So I do believe in the next couple of years, we are going to see a lot more research, and it's going to lead to better treatments for a lot of people that have ailment.
Yeah. I was interviewing a company that's looking at derivatives of cannabinoids, and some of the research that they're doing and some of the trials that they're already conducted in animal studies are astounding. So they're looking at autoimmune diseases that have never before had a cure, and they're looking at cures for some of these never curable diseases. So I think it's very exciting what's coming down the pike.
Yeah, it's very amazing. And we recently invested in a cannabis research firm that studies terpenes and their effects on the body and flavoring of cannabis. And I've been digging into that, and it's just fascinating that what we're learning about, and not just the effects, but everyone's different. So you and I could have the same strain at the same time, and it would affect us differently.
Sure.
And that's what's so exciting to me, is how do we figure out what's the proper treatment for someone who's your age and a female and has a certain thing, as opposed to me, a male at a different age, that has a different problem. Like, different cannabis, it works for every person differently.
Sure.
And that, to me, is an exciting part of our future, because right now we still really don't know a lot about what's effective. We know what we like sometimes,
sure,
but what's really, really effective against specific ailments, there's a lot of promise there.
Is there any post-marketing surveillance studies that are going on, or any, I guess, consumer reaction testing or feedback that's being corralled in any location at the moment?
There's probably not enough. I mean, I bet you there is. I don't know really of a lot of it going on yet, but I think it's an excellent idea. And speaking of data, though, we're trying to connect. What we're doing also is trying to collect purchase data through point of sale systems or websites or apps, and trying to figure out who's buying what for what treatment or what ailment. And so certain apps, you buy your cannabis and you record it and you say, I bought this indica Afghani Kush for sleep. And I took it, and you can record, that this helps you sleep, for example. And so we're at the beginning of these things, but we'd like to start collecting a lot more data on what people are using for what specific reason. And so the more that we can understand that people are using this particular strain and they're getting a lot of great sleep out of it, or they're going to the gym after they have this sour diesel sativa or something, and they really like the workout if they get out of that, I think we're going to find some really interesting stuff out of that. And that's going back to your question, though. We would love to find out more of that information. No one, it's hard, though. It's not being done the way you would typically do consumer studies, but it will. It's a great idea.
How is it being done currently, and what do you feel would help support the data collection for a lot of these indications?
I think Yeah, I think it's being done a lot by individual companies. So through our venture fund, we've talked to a lot of companies that are building database on users. And one of them recently has software in 1,600 dispensaries, like ordering like kiosks and website, and they're collecting, data on what people are buying and for what. But at this point in time, I would say it's still very small scale. And there's so many different markets that to me, it doesn't get really relevant until you have more of a larger scale data set that really follows trends. And part of the reason why is every single market in this country has a different set of rules.
Right.
And they have different, like, for example, Pennsylvania, where I am, there's no edibles. So there's no point in trying to market any edibles here. And in California and Oregon and Washington, you have pretty much everything you want. There's so much product development. And then you go to a place like, New Jersey, which has a very small medical program, and there's only 11 stores open in the whole state. So, I think from a product mix standpoint, we don't know enough yet, but it'd be great to start collecting that. That's kind of what we're trying to do, is collect it from a whole bunch of different places and put it together and have insights come out of it. That's part of some of our projects.
Very nice. And is a lot of this data collection through dispensaries, or how are you even interfacing with the consumer?
Well, it is through dispensaries, but typically not one dispensary at a time. What we're working with is companies that work with dispensaries. So the typical dispensary has a few different needs for software. One is they need tracking of their stuff, and they need to be able to track patients and sales, and they need to report to the state. And there's like Metric is one of them, and MJ Freeway is another one, and BioTrack. So these particular companies are interfacing with the state legislative body and the consumer and making sure that it's a medical purchase. But then you have, like in the other states where it's not medical, you have point of sale companies that when you order, like I mentioned, you go in and you order on a kiosk or they plug it in. So we're collecting data from those companies. Then you have delivery companies that have this is a big new trend now that we have COVID, is delivery. And so there's a lot more places where you can get cannabis delivered. So we're dropping pixels on websites and collecting information there. So we really want to be collecting information on all purchases in as many directions as we can. Finally, one other thing I'll add is that we take the CRM list of the dispensary. So when you go to the dispensary and you give them your phone number or your email address, that's another piece of data that we want, that we can model off of.
You'd mentioned something about geofencing. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. This is really popular now for a lot of reasons. But what we want to do is two things, geofencing and geoframing. So for geofencing, we want to target an area and really basically capture every cell phone device ID that's in that area at a certain time. So, for example, if we made a map of every dispensary in the state, pick any state, and we just captured for 30 days, we looked at the IDs that went in there, and frequently, like if someone's phone was in there once a week or a couple times a month, we put them in a bucket, say that they're a frequent shopper at a dispensary. The other thing with geoframing, though, is being able to capture a point in time and go backwards and look back and say, let's capture as many device IDs as been in this location in the last 4 months. And it's not perfect going backwards, but it does allow you to track customers that go into different places. You can also target people who go into other types of places other than dispensaries. So you could target people in nearby places that are at coffee shops or at gyms or things like that. So it's basically a way to just capture someone's device ID, because almost everyone is constantly giving off a location signal via Google Maps or social media. Unless you turn your GPS off, your location is being tracked at all times.
So when Google Maps follows your directions, or I guess knows where you are. They sell this data to secondary vendors. Is that kind of what happens?
Yeah, and I know that just sounded scary what I just said.
It totally did. It sounded very big.
I know. Let me make it sound a little less scary. Basically, what the device ID is completely anonymous. Start there. So your device ID, no one can track it and say this is your phone, but they can see that the device ID has been in a location, and then all they can really do at that point is target you with an ad. So when you log on to either an app or a mobile website, let's say you're checking the weather and you see a banner ad at the bottom of the weather. Okay. So if next time you check your weather app, you'll see an ad on the bottom and it might be for a local business. Okay. So all they know is that you live in that area or you're in that area and you're checking an app and we think you might want to come in and buy some food here or something. So it's not so, but that the device here, there's one way to stop this from happening, and that is shut your phone off. But no one wants to do that. We have to stay connected all the time. Right. I always tell people it's a trade-off. You know, I'm old enough to remember way before phones, and no one knew where I was anytime unless I picked up the telephone. You know, now I could be tracked, but I could actually turn my phone off if I don't want to be. Right. So I believe that it's less creepy when you understand it more, and we do relevant advertising is actually a good thing. But then again, that's what I do, so I have to say that.
Well, I mean, the fact is, this is something that's already happening, right? So it's a sign of the times,
every day
right?
for years.
Yeah. So you have to be very diligent to pull yourself out of this matrix if you're so inclined, right? So I think
well, I would like to I'd like to get an ad for cannabis. Sorry to stop you there, but I shop at this store in local neighborhood. And if I got an ad while I was driving around nearby and getting some food, and I got an ad on my weather thing and said, 10% off of eighths today or something, I would like that. I would probably once in a while go in and because I see a special or something. So it is helpful when it's done like that.
Right. Absolutely. And it seems like it's ongoing with a variety of other consumer products. So this is just a continuation of what's going on in the broader market.
Well, I think you bring up a great point because I've been saying, the same thing for many years is that this is becoming a very normalized business, and it's exactly like regular CPG. It's everything. We could see the future here. It's in those established markets. It's just like the liquor store or, some other store nearby. It's a retail store with products and brands and discounts and sales and promotions. And I've been seeing a lot of digital billboards lately with cannabis companies, and so it is becoming very much like regular consumer marketing.
Now, there's obviously a lot of restrictions with cannabis advertising. In general, what is allowed, what is not allowed?
Well, let's separate it between the two big boys and everybody else, because Google and Facebook take approximately 60 to 65% of most of advertising budgets all over the place. Those two have said no cannabis at all. So for now, at the moment, you cannot advertise any cannabis on the two biggest things. So what's left, though, is a lot of other options, including data-driven programmatic, which is coming on strong. So again, like you said, just like regular products are sold using programmatic advertising that's data-driven, cannabis is definitely heading in that direction. Then you have mobile, and you have streaming advertising. That's actually getting really popular, is advertising cannabis brands through over-the-top platforms like Roku and Social Club TV. So you are seeing a lot of other publishers starting to take cannabis advertising, knowing that Google and Facebook won't, but seeing an opportunity and a lot of marketing dollars coming on strong.
Interesting. What do you think the future holds in this industry in terms of advertising and really meeting?
I think a lot of these, I would say almost every person that's out there that says no cannabis advertising right now is doing it because of their lawyers.
Mm-hmm.
and they would love to take it. Okay. So, I mean, there's definitely going to be some that for other reasons, they think they're against the plant to begin with. The majority of people that are not allowing cannabis advertising is because it's federally illegal, and they're concerned about hurting their regular businesses, the regular verticals that they're in. So they don't want to risk getting in trouble by taking cannabis advertising. That's the first reason. The second reason is, in order for those guys to take on another vertical like this, it has to be big. And when I say big, I mean, we think cannabis is big, but when you compare it to alcohol or travel or auto advertising, it's not big at all yet, right? Okay. So that's Google makes money off of auto and travel a lot. So cannabis has not entered that, multi-billion-dollar stage yet. We all believe it will, and it will soon. So back to your question, though, I think that when they have the political cover and the size of the budgets gets a lot bigger, I think that all of these companies are going to take advertising from cannabis. There's no question in my mind that Facebook and Instagram will eventually have it when politically it's correct. Right now, they know they already have enough trouble. They were on Capitol Hill last week testifying about other things. They don't need to mess with cannabis at the moment, but I think they will soon.
Interesting. If you were not in the cannabis market actively, and if you wanted to, I guess, invest in a specific portion of this industry, what would you bet on?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, we've literally invested in like 15 different sectors, and we think that they're all interesting in different ways. Well, look, obviously right now, I do think that if you bet on the right brand, that grows across multiple states, that could be really good. We have some there. I also believe strongly in data and technology. And I believe that in terms of investing, that there's going to be a lot of consolidation in certain sectors. So once there are more states that come online, there's going to be companies that are bought, and there's going to be exits. And I believe in the technology side, there's going to be more than a few. So I think cultivation is also another place where, in the right location, I think it is a good investment, because I do think over time, these growers start to really get their, grows going and efficient, and the markets are getting bigger. And so if you have a grow in the right spot, it could be a very good long-term investment.
Now, right spot within the United States or right spot outside of the United States? Inside.
Yeah. I meant we have one in Oregon that's in a really great location, and it was definitely rough for the first couple of years, and the price went down, if you remember, in Oregon. And there was also they also gave out too many grow permits, and unfortunately, a lot of growers couldn't survive, and they didn't make it. And I feel terrible for all that, but the places that survived are doing really well now, because the prices come on strong. It's a very good market, and it's super quality cannabis out there. So that's a good market to have a cultivation in now. It wasn't 2 years ago.
Oh, interesting. So the market really evolves very quickly. So if you're investing, it sounds like you really need to be informed and know your data.
There's one thing that I've studied nonstop since 2014, and I recommend anybody do this, is that every single state has a different velocity of cannabis legalization. So you have a vote. After a vote, you have a certain amount of time, and then you have politicians who don't really do things quickly, and they come in and they make regulations. And then you have the opening of the first stores, and then you have the opening of, and so on and so on. And this plays out over years, right? And so what's interesting to me, though, is that if you figure out where the state is going and get in, when it's about to take off, and each market may be looked at differently. So the good example today is Michigan and Illinois and Oklahoma, like markets like that, which you don't necessarily think about right now. They're accelerating rapidly. And so there's a lot of opportunity in those states. And I also believe that the East Coast is about to be a lot bigger because you have New Jersey has a ballot initiative.
Mm-hmm.
You already have Massachusetts. You have Maine coming online soon. You have, I think, after New Jersey passes it, you're going to have a lot of movement in Pennsylvania and New York. They're going to be pushing for it in the next year or so or less. So I think city by city, if you look at and state by state, you can see the acceleration, but not just of the political thing, but also just the market maturity.
Mm-hmm.
So as I mentioned earlier, like there's certain products that aren't even allowed in like Florida, had this no flower rule for a while.
Right.
And so now there's flower going down there, and these companies like Trulieve are doing really well. So I think that as each city and state changes their rules and loosens things, then there's business opportunity on different levels.
Interesting. What do you think happened with the Canadian operators? Their stocks went up ridiculously and then they crashed. What do you think they did wrong, or do you think that's just a part of the evolution of the market?
Well, that's let's see, two-part answer. First of all, they rushed. They when they legalized cannabis nationwide, they didn't think through a lot of the regulations, and they had a patchwork from different provinces. They had way different rules, right? So if you're in Western Canada, there was some rules in Eastern Canada, and so each province then had to make their own individual rules about like whether you had to order online or whether you had to open stores. And so that was completely botched. Most people would agree. The second thing that happened is they really, I love my Canadian brothers and sisters, but they're really not that great at growing weed in general. I hope I don't offend anybody. I wish I did. I probably shouldn't have said that.
So
but
it's kind of cold.
I don't want to, I really don't want to offend anyone, please. But I mean, when you go to California and Oregon and you go to the Emerald Triangle and you see the weed they're growing there, it's just really tough for that to happen in Canada. So in the beginning of this experiment, the cannabis was not good by anyone's imagined stretch. It's just they weren't growing enough of it, and it wasn't good. And they've gotten a lot better. So I think what happened was everybody got excited that they had this national country, and canopy growth made a lot of headlines, and a lot of people made money in the stock market. But the reality on the ground was they weren't producing enough cannabis. The quality wasn't great. And there wasn't enough people. I mean, that's the other problem. Canada is smaller than California.
Right.
So there just wasn't enough, so it took them a while. But look, I give them a lot of credit. Is they did it right in terms of politics instead of the way we did it, like patchwork I mentioned, state by state and all this discombobulation. But Canada said, you know what, we're just going to let the whole country do it, and we're going to figure out the rules later. So we're doing it kind of backwards, and we're taking a lot longer. But I think that there's still a lot of promise in Canada because there's also a lot of capital. So that's the other thing. Let me say what they did right is that they allowed banks and institutions and public companies to fund cannabis deals. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot more liquidity. In fact, people raised money before they even had their grows. They were just raising money without having anything in the ground yet, like just, and so they were able to raise very large amounts of money from big institutions. In this country, we have to raise money from venture capital or individual friends and family, typically, because banks and institutions can't lend to cannabis. And Canada, they fixed that a long while ago.
Interesting. And I think that really affects
That's something that could happen here.
Right. Looks like that also affects your asset allocation. So, you make different plans when you have access to that much liquidity.
Absolutely. And I do think that that's going to happen here when we get into the new year and we get the new people in charge of Congress. There's a good chance that we're going to get a banking law passed. And we're going to have, that's one thing that could accelerate our industry a lot, is having more liquidity on the financial markets.
Interesting. Well, you shared with us a lot of insight. Obviously, it looks like you are a numbers guy. Can you tell us how you arrived at this place where you really love analyzing data? How did you get your start?
Well, my start goes back to when I was about 12 or 13 years old. I went to a lot of basketball games, the Philadelphia 76ers. In those days, my father actually worked there as a 24-second shot clock operator. And he would give me a program at the beginning of the game, and I would sit there and keep stats for fun. And I would just keep the points and the rebounds for the NBA players like Julius Erving and Moses Malone. And I'm sure I'm a lot older than you, and but they're like old time guys in the '70s, and like great basketball, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson. So I grew up working there, and when I got out of college in 1988, I got a job working for the NBA, keeping basketball stats at Sixers home games, and I've been there for 30 years, basically just keeping points and rebounds and block shots and steals, and really like analyzing the game through the stat sheet. So every timeout, every minute of every game, that someone is looking at the numbers and trying to figure out what's happening in the game based on the stats. So I just loved it, and I got into it many, many years ago, and it sort of was very interesting when I got into digital advertising. It was very easy for me to pick it up because I had already been doing basketball stats for many years. And so the digital advertising data and analytics was very much comforting to me. I really enjoyed it right away. And I realized that I could be pretty good at it if I studied.
For those people that say math is not fun, you've had a very exciting career in very exciting industries using math. So it's always
well. I would just say, let me just add that I think I really do love math, but only basic math, and I'm not good at any high class math like calculus or trigonometry. That kind of stuff is definitely not great for me. But I've learned that my strength a long time ago was just basic addition, subtraction, multiplication. Percentages really. Like basketball field goals are all about percentages, and so are click-through rates in digital advertising. It's the same exact thing. So I just got pretty good at that part, and that's taken me a long way.
That's very fantastic. Now, are you watching the psychedelic market and its evolution as well?
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm very, very interested in that on a few different levels.
So tell us a little bit more. Do you think it's going to parallel the cannabis industry, or how do you think it's going to be different?
I think in certain ways it will, but in many fundamental ways it won't. So the way it will is, I think that there's a lot of similar people that believe the same thing. In other words, that the making psychedelics illegal was a mistake. They stopped funding any research on this in the 60s. And Timothy Leary was getting money at Harvard to study, and things were going actually quite well. And then the counterculture discovered LSD, and they stopped all money. It became outlawed really in a big way. So in a similar way, it mirrored the criminalization of cannabis. So I think the acceptance of psychedelics in the medicinal world will be parallel to what's happening to cannabis. The commercialization of it, however, I think will not be the same, because psychedelics are considerably more powerful in many cases than cannabis. And I don't think that you can put psychedelics on a shelf in a store and be, without a lot more control over it. So I think that getting psychedelics at a retail store on a website is a long way off. I do think that I will give you another parallel, that I do think that there are incredibly promising data that are coming out about what it does, what it can do. So the research, again, is getting really exciting. There's research on ketamine for depression. There's research on psilocybin for a whole bunch of things. There's research on LSD for addiction, like where it's really helping people quit cigarettes or other harder things. And so there's a lot of really, really interesting stuff. I've participated in a few online conferences where I hear from experts about really what's happening. And so just like cannabis, though, we do need more funding and more time. And I believe that with those two things, we're going to be like discovering, again, we're going to be like, wow, we really should have allowed people to use this before, because look at what it's doing to help people.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of promise there.
It is very amazing. What is your thought process? I know there's a lot of companies that are trying to take the euphoria out of the molecules and trying to basically make sure that these psychedelics are not intoxicating. What is your thought process on that manipulation?
I don't agree with that. I think part of what they do, part of the amazing thing they do that is tied to the psychedelic part of it. And I think there's a way to there's microdosing, which is certainly probably a very good way to get people started. And then there's assisted, sessions where a clinician is sitting with you and you have a mask on and you go into a deep psychedelic experience and someone's there, holding your hand if you need it. So I think that's going to happen too. But, I do think that I think we have to be careful, is what I'm basically saying, because there's a lot of unknowns and there's certain people that should not ever do this. I want to be very clear on that and draw that parallel from cannabis. I believe that for the large majority of the people, a little bit of cannabis is completely harmless. Mm-hmm. I really, truly believe that. Psychedelics, though, for the wrong person, and even a small hit of acid could be a problem, right? And we all know this. And I think like a person has to be, in a good mental place, set and setting, or something that these folks always talk about, is that you have to be in the right frame of mind, in the right place to really have a good experience. And there's people that definitely have had bad experience with psychedelics. So I think we have to be extremely careful as we move ahead.
It's very interesting just kind of seeing the evolution of the psychedelic market. I'm seeing that there's a lot of philosophies on how these products should be legalized. So there's some advocates that are strictly medicinal. There's some advocates that say it should be decriminalized. So there's a lot of different thought processes that seem to be very passionate about their specific path. I don't recall seeing that much diversity and I guess divergence of opinions in cannabis. I felt like when cannabis was evolving, people were either advocating or against it. But I feel like in the psychedelic market, you're definitely seeing a lot of conversations about manipulating the molecules, taking the euphoria out, and then there's many vocal people that are against it. I see there was this thread that I saw on LinkedIn that I thought was really interesting. There was a bunch of founders of these psychedelic companies that were calling each other out for not having a psychedelic experience. And some of them were saying, if you haven't tried psychedelics and you haven't had that spiritual experience, you have no business being in the industry. And I don't ever recall cannabis being that dramatic. So,
no.
So it's interesting, yeah. Kind of fun
to watch. Part of it is very fascinating to watch. And I think a big part of it is that there's a lot less known about psychedelics. And, everybody has been around, anyone that's under the age of about 70 has been around cannabis at some point in their life, and so they know, if they don't consume it themselves, they've been around someone who's smoking cannabis and they kind of know what happens. They get a general idea. Mm-hmm. When you talk about psychedelics now, and when I personally mention it to some people who don't into it, they think I'm crazy. Like, oh my God, you're taking magic mushrooms. I'm like, yeah, but like, I'm not, you don't quite understand. They think that the TV is going to attack me, and I'm seeing like all sorts of crazy stuff in my vision, which is not at all true. Okay, it's not. I think people just don't understand it, and we were taught the wrong thing. Okay, I thought the same thing, and I'm glad I didn't do it. Another message that I have is it should not be done by people that are young, really young. You should wait until you're old enough to handle it. 20s, 30s, 40s. I don't believe that this is anything that should be messed around with when you're a teenager by any stretch, right? And I'm glad I didn't really experiment with psychedelics until I was 45 years old was the first time I really took LSD, and I enjoyed it. But at that point in time, my head was on straight, and I knew, I wasn't, I was a fully fledged human and adult. So I think that we have to be really careful about how that goes out there. But I do think we need to educate people, though, on what it is not. Okay, it is not dangerous. That is the number one thing. People. I had a really ridiculous argument with a friend the other day, and he said he was talking about cocaine, and I said, I never done cocaine. I'm afraid of it. I won't do it ever. He's like, yeah, well, acid's worse than cocaine. I'm like, really? You really want to, but you really got any fact on that? Do you have any idea what you're talking about? Like, he was trying to convince me that him doing a bunch of cocaine is better than doing acid. And I didn't really get into it. I said, listen, I've done a lot of research on this, and there's no question in my mind that cocaine is more dangerous than acid or mushrooms. I will prove this to you if you would like the proof. But that's because when we were growing up, people thought that LSD was a much different and horrible thing. And so there's been a lot of misinformation. And I think that's where the difference is, that we have to bridge that gap. And maybe research will be it, but also just getting the word out that this isn't what you were taught.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with how I think our government used psychedelics for nefarious reasons in MK Ultra. So a lot of people were exposed to a very horrifying aspect of it, which it obviously is fluid enough to go in that direction, and that is why set and setting is so important. But I feel that there's been a lot of political chess moves that have made psychedelics the boogeyman that they have been so far, right? And I feel like we're starting to understand some of that data is becoming unclassified. There's a lot more research that's going on. So psychedelics are becoming demystified, but I think they're very mysterious for a very long time.
I think you bring up a good point. I think the government definitely did a lot of things that we don't know about back in those days, and we really don't know what happened with these soldiers when they were tested. And we also, it may have gone on like longer than we know as well. There probably was other things that were done, and I think that it was all going actually kind of well in some ways until the counterculture and Timothy Leary bringing LSD out to the masses, and the government, basically freaked out and thought that every person, that was taking these drugs was just going to tune in and drop out. And we know now that was actually not the case at all. And, but it's been so many years. I guess the frustrating thing is that was 30 some years ago. And we've wasted a lot of time when we could have had research and we could have been helping people with severe problems. I mean, I just want to point out that, some of the medicine that's going down with psychedelics is to cure suicide, to help with suicidal thoughts, to end of life issues. When people are given terminal diagnosis of cancer, they start giving them psychedelic mushrooms to help their last couple months be better. I mentioned addiction to cigarettes. I mean, there's a lot of really serious problems that we have, and psychedelics are showing a lot of really good effect on these, and it makes sense. And I also read recently that the guy that founded Alcoholics Anonymous wanted to use, he used LSD to help himself, and he wanted to have LSD be part of the treatment in the 12-step program, but that's when the government, was like, LSD is no go. And so that's pretty amazing that someone like that believed, and I think that was in the 60s. I'm not sure, but so there's a lot of things that we could do with this stuff that could be really helpful for some serious problems that we have. Not to mention the mental, I also believe, just forget about serious issues. We do have, a lot of people have basic mental issues or just everyone, I don't care who you are, has stress in their life. And I like the term, the betterment of well people, which is kind of what I consider myself, is I use psychedelics because I'm a well person who wants to get better. I'm not trying to cure a very serious thing, but I think so. There's a lot of different people that could use it for different purposes, including improving business performance. So that's another interesting aspect of people in Silicon Valley that regularly microdose and help them with their careers.
And a lot of biohackers do that too, for just improving their physiological efficiencies. When I obviously was a child of the DARE generation, and I remember I was having a dialogue with a friend of mine that's a PhD chemist, and he was telling me about the evolution of triptans, which are migraine medicines, and I suffer from very, very horrifying migraines. And he was talking about how triptans were derived from tryptamines, which are psychedelics. And that was basically the initial thought process behind triptans. And that's why they're so effective, because they do have a love of getting into the brain, and they are effective in that level. And that's why psychedelics are so effective, because they're very neurogenic. They do transform your brain, and the nerves seem to love them and absorb them. So that's when I started wondering. I'm like, I don't know if this deer conversation was truly accurate. Let me start doing some research on my own. So it's very interesting how therapeutic these compounds can truly be.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's also just, there's so many different ways that we can use it effectively, and I think that the mental aspect of it too, not just you mentioned like the neurons firing and the brain waves connecting, and there's certain things I can't explain it very well, but I know that there's things that happen in your thought processes and your connections with other people. I frequently use psychedelics when I'm at music festivals. And with like 20,000, really cool people that are jamming out. And so there's a lot of different ways that it can bring things into someone's life. And I think that we're also going to figure out ways to just put it into easier formats. So there's a lot of biotech research on creating synthetic, formulations that come in pills that you could just take a pill and instead of a depression medication, let's say, you take a little ketamine pill. That could be coming soon. And it could work a lot better and be safer for you than being on, and even opioids. It could replace opioids in many cases.
I think ketamine is pretty well commercialized. Janssen even has an intranasal spray. So I think ketamine is pretty much out there. So that's very accessible.
Yeah, you're right.
Right. But I don't know if it's the most effective antidepressant. I feel that some of the, like psilocybin, might be a lot more effective. So I think it'll be interesting to see the data and to see what comes out of a lot of these studies.
I've been doing a lot of research on psilocybin lately. I believe that we haven't really scratched the surface on what it can do in different ways. It's a pretty remarkable substance. I mean, mushroom family in general is amazing as a food as well. And so I think that we are going to find more uses for psilocybin in the near future. And there's a lot of investment in that area.
So speaking of investments, do you feel that the size of the psychedelic market is going to parallel the cannabis market, or how do you think that will differ?
Well, initially, no. I don't think it will come close to cannabis at all. And maybe not, probably never, but it will get bigger when it has, I believe, that pharmaceutical proof. Once we can, as I mentioned, get it into some sort of, I do think it will get a lot bigger. But I don't think it'll ever get as big as cannabis, because I think that there's so many more people out there that consume cannabis that will never go near psychedelics no matter what. But I do believe that from a doctor standpoint, I think doctors will start prescribing it a lot more if they could. And that could, so the amount of times that a doctor recommends cannabis versus something else, that may get a little bit close, right? So, because I think the doctor, when he's allowed to, will be maybe prescribing something for sleep, that's not, it's not a sleeping pill. Maybe it's a small mushroom, like a microdose of mushroom for sleep instead of a, sleep Ambien, for example. So that could happen from a physician, but I don't think the recreational market for psychedelics will be that big as cannabis.
Right. And just from a, research perspective, I've seen some psychedelic gummies and some edibles, and that frankly scares me. Can't imagine someone getting into, there's always accidental ingestion, and I just cannot imagine someone taking a bunch of mushroom gummies and unwittingly be completely catatonic. So
we've seen what happens when people have too many when people have a cannabis edible and they take a bite And then half hour later, they say, I don't feel anything from that edible. And then they take another bite.
Yeah.
And then, it's half hour later, they're on the couch. So, yeah, I think that with psychedelics, that could be a little scarier too. So it does have to be super careful and controlled. And, you have to have the right mindset.
Right. Well, this was a very illuminating conversation. Thank you for sharing a lot of your insights with us. Any last minute
Thank you for having me.
thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I do enjoy talking to you, and these are great questions. And, I guess whoever's, I don't know how you do this with your listeners, but I'm easy to find online if you want to look me up and contact me. I love making friends in the cannabis space. And I really love what I'm doing because as I mentioned, I believe in the medicine that we're bringing. And I think it's really doing wonderful things. I also believe, very happy to say that we've created a lot of jobs through our investments in our venture fund. Every check that we write to a company includes someone getting a new job. Someone gets hired after we invest, and I really love that. And, I just am excited for the future. I wish I had more money to bet today. I'd be putting more money down on the table right this second if I could, because I believe we're headed in a great direction overall. And I'm grateful for that. I just want to add that.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. I hope to continue this conversation in the future. Hopefully it'll be after federal legalization. We'll find out. But thank you. And it's been lovely talking to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Taya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.